This is a made-up story meant to be fun. Please leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from. It's always interesting to see how far these stories can go. In the fall of 1950, a routine patrol shift in the remote backwoods of West Virginia ended without any explanation. Virgil Daines, a 42-year-old security guard who worked at a lumber company's remote outpost near the Monongah Forest, didn't show up for his scheduled shift. His station was a weathered cabin that was 7 miles away from. The closest logging road was found to be locked from the inside. His rifle stayed on the wall. Virgil Daines was gone, but his boots were by the door. The Greenbrier Lumber Company had been in that area since 1923. They had a network of guard stations to stop people from stealing wood and look out for fire hazards during the dry months. Guards usually worked in shifts at these stations, spending 3 nights alone before going back to the main camp. People saw the isolation as part of the job. Men who took these jobs were often those who liked to be alone and found peace in the quiet of mountain nights. That was exactly what Virgil Daines was like. He was born in 1908 in the small town of Marlington, West Virginia. His family had worked in the coal and timber industries for 3 generations. In 1919, a support timber broke in the Pocahontas No. 3 mine near Bramwell, killing his father, Oswald Daines. The collapse killed 7 men who were trapped under tons of rocks and coal. When Ruth got the news, Virgil was 11 years old. She had to raise 3 kids on the money she made as a seamstress, which was barely enough to pay the rent on their small house on the edge of Marlington. As the oldest, Virgil knew right away that his childhood was over. He dropped out of school at 14 to help support the family by getting jobs when he could. The sawmills were mostly where they worked, loading lumber under railroad cars, stacking boards, and drying sheds. This work required strength and a lot of endurance, but not much schooling. During harvest time, he would sometimes work on the farms that lined the river valleys, bringing in hay, fixing fences, or doing any other work the farmers needed. He became known as someone who was always on time, did his job without complaining, and didn't cause any problems. By the time he turned 20, Daines had become a part of the local economy of temporary workers, moving from job to job as the seasons and opportunities changed. People who knew him back then said he was self-contained and only spoke when he needed to. He would rather let his work speak for him. He didn't have any bad habits, like drinking too much, gambling, or looking for the kinds of fun that other young men did. He looked happy, or at least resigned, to living a life of routine by himself. In 1932, there were rumors that he was briefly engaged to a woman named Iris Caldwell, who was a schoolteacher from Hillsboro who had come to Marlington to teach at the elementary school. The details of their relationship are still unclear. Some people remembered seeing them together at church events and walking along the Riverside Path, which was the town's main promenade. But by the summer of that year, Iris was back in Hillsboro, and Daines never said anything about her again. When friends asked what had happened, he would just say that it hadn't worked out and not go into any more detail. The next year, Iris married a pharmacist from Lewisburg. No one knew for sure, but she and Daines never talked to each other. Again. For Daines, the years from 1932 to 1943 went by in a similar way. Work, small savings, and long periods of being alone with only short social interactions because of work or community obligations. In 1938, his mother died of a stroke that came on quickly while she was hanging laundry in the backyard of the house she had rented for 19 years. Daines planned a simple funeral and paid for it with money he had been saving for just such an occasion. He took care of the practical things in the same way, the same quiet skill he brought to everything else. Kenneth, his younger brother, had moved to Pennsylvania in 1935 to work in the steel mills near Pittsburgh. His sister Mavis had gotten married and moved to Charleston. The three siblings kept in touch from time to time after their mother died, but they didn't see each other very often. Daines joined the Army in 1943, even though he was in his mid-30s and could have gotten out of it because he worked in an important industry. He never clearly explained why he made this choice. Some people thought he had gotten caught up in the patriotic excitement that followed Pearl Harbor. Others said that the enlistment bonus, the promise of steady pay, and the appeal of structure and purpose were more straightforward reasons. His military service record, which was made public and sent to the National Archives in 1968, shows that he completed basic training at Camp Lee, Virginia, and then worked in quartermaster units, first in England, getting supplies ready for the invasion of France, and then in occupied Germany, where he managed a depot. Operations in the crazy months after the wars ended. Soldiers who worked with him and were later interviewed for reasons not related to his disappearance remembered him as quiet and capable, someone who did his job without complaint but didn't make many close friends. Lyle Hutchkins, a former corporal, was interviewed in 1962 by a military historian who was looking into logistics units. He remembered Daines as someone who seemed most at ease during night shifts at the supply depots, working alone in the dark, carefully organizing things. Hutchkins said that Daines didn't often join the other men for cards or drinks. Instead, he liked to read or take long walks through the countryside around their current posting in his free time. Daines didn't get any awards other than the usual campaign ribbons, and he was honorably discharged in early 1946. He went back to West Virginia and worked at a few different jobs before accepting the job at Greenbrier Lumber in 1947. He liked the job right away. The guard stations were quiet, the routines were predictable, and there were no complicated social obligations. All of these things worked well with his personality in a way that few other jobs did. Luther Carrick, Daines' boss, said in early performance reviews that Daines seemed most comfortable when he was given the most remote assignments, stations that other guards thought were too lonely. The station where the Daines disappeared was on a hill of about 2,800 feet, only reachable by a steep footpath that went through a thick hardwood forest with oak, hickory, and maple trees. It took about 90 minutes of steady hiking from the nearest place where you could leave your car to get to the start of the trail. A trip that put even the most experienced woodsman to the test. The path crossed 3 big ridges, went down into 2 hollows where small streams ran cold and clear, and then climbed one last steep hill to get to the clearing where the cabin was there. The building itself was about 12 by 16 feet and was made of rough-hewn logs that had turned a silvery gray color over time. The company built it in 1938 when they were expanding their northern timber operations. The logs were cut on the property, shaped with broadexes, and put together with good but not great craftsmanship. There were gaps between the logs that had been filled with a mix of clay and moss. This mix needed to be maintained every now and then to stay effective against wind and rain. The roof was made of rough-cut boards covered with overlapping sheets of tar paper. It was steep enough to let snow slide off, but not so steep that it needed complicated framing. The furniture inside was simple and useful. A narrow bed with a thin mattress stuffed with corn husks was against the eastern wall, where it could catch the morning light from the small window above it. In the middle of the room was a cast-iron wood stove that had been taken from a farmhouse that had been torn down and brought up the mountain in pieces, its stovepipe going through a carefully sealed hole in the roof. A single plank of white oak laid across 2 sawhorses made a table that was used for eating and doing paperwork. Along with the table was a single chair made of bent hickory branches and a woven seat that had been fixed many times. The guard supplies were on shelves made of scrap wood, a lot of canned goods like beans, tomatoes, and peaches, as well as coffee, flour, salt, and a jar of lard. Basic needs that would last for the shifts that last 3 days. There was a water bucket by the door that was filled with water from a spring that came out of the hillside about 50 yards down the slope from the cabin. The spring ran all year long, cold and clean, and fed a small stream that disappeared into the thick forest below. The wall-mounted phone that was put in 1940 was the company's main concession to safety concerns. The device was easy to use. A wooden box containing the mechanism with a crank handle on the right side and a receiver hanging from a hook to the left. There was a different ring pattern for each station in the guard network. A certain order of long and short cranks that marked the caller. To get to the main camp's central switchboard, a guard would slowly turn the crank 3 times, stop, and then turn it 2 more times quickly. The switchboard operator, who was usually someone's wife and made a small amount of money watching the system during the day, would answer the phone and connect the caller to the right person. The system was moody and didn't work right when the weather was bad. Damaged the lines, which were affected by moisture that broke connections, and because the company only sometimes provided the constant maintenance that miles of wire strung through the wilderness needed. But it worked well most of the time, giving the guards their only way to talk to people outside the prison while they were on duty. Their only way to get help in an emergency, their only way to report fires, trespassers, or other strange behavior that warranted the entire guard network's existence. The closest station, which had a guard named Casper Drum at the time, was 4 miles northeast along a ridgeline that ran roughly parallel to the Greenbrier River Valley. Drum, a man in his 50s who had worked for the company since the late 1920s, was very familiar with the area. He had lived in these mountains all his life, hunted them since he was a boy, and knew where springs, caves, and game trails that weren't on any map were. He had a lot of useful and deep knowledge that he had gained over time, through decades of first-hand experience instead of formal education. Drum later told the police that he and Danes had a working relationship. Over the years, they had worked in neighboring areas. They weren't exactly friends, but they respected each other because they had worked together and understood each other. They would run into each other from time to time during daytime patrols when their areas crossed along certain ridgelines or creek drainages. These meetings were short and usually only had in sharing useful information, like the weather, signs of animal activity, and the state of the trails. Then they would go their separate ways, each going back to his own station and being alone. Drum told the police on October 18, 1950, that he last saw Danes on the afternoon of October 13th. The meeting took place near a rocky outcrop that marked the edge of their patrol areas. From there, you could see for miles across the forested valleys below. Danes had been patrolling a part of the perimeter to look for signs of illegal cutting or fire damage, which is what guards do during the day. They had been together for about 20 minutes, mostly in comfortable silence, watching a storm system build over the western ridges. Dark clouds were moving in from Ohio, promising rain that the forest needed after a dry September. Drum remembered that Danes seemed completely normal during this meeting. He wasn't upset or distant in any way, his usual shyness. His behavior was the same as it had been in dozens of other meetings, calm, observant, and focused on the tasks at hand. When they said goodbye, Danes told Drum that he had found fresh bear scat near one of the timber roads. He suggested that Drum write about it in his next report so that the logging crews could be warned. Bears were common in these mountains and usually stayed away from people, but they could be aggressive if they were surprised or if they had been eating food scraps left behind by campers. The crews needed to know when bears were moving around in the places where they would be working. On October 14th, the next day, Danes finished his usual logbook entry. The log was a regular composition book with marbled covers. The entries went back to July of that year, when he first started working at that station. Previous guards had kept similar logs as part of the company's documentation system, but those earlier books had been gathered and stored at the main camp. Daines's log was his own record of his observations and activities while he was in this position. His writing in the log was always the same, blocky capital letters that were clearly made with care, the marks of someone who hadn't had much formal education but was proud of how neat and accurate they were. The format of each entry was pretty much the same, the date at the top, the weather, the temperature if he could guess it, the direction and strength of the wind, and the visibility. Then observations, which are usually short notes about animals, trail conditions, and any sounds, or things that stood out to them. The entry for October 14th was normal, saying that the temperature at dawn was 48 degrees and the wind was coming from the northwest. Visibility was good, except for the fog that filled the valleys in the morning like a white ocean, making only the highest ridges look like islands. He wrote down that he saw a small herd of deer, 5 does and 2 fawns, moving through a clearing around noon. They were eating the last green growth before winter. He said he heard a pileated woodpecker, which is a big bird with a unique call, working on a dead chestnut snag close to the spring. The chestnut blight had killed most of the big trees decades ago, but their trunks were still gray monuments to what had been providing homes for woodpeckers and other birds that nest in holes. The last line of the entry for October 14th said, "Heard something moving past the northwest tree line after midnight, likely deer." This note, which was short and seemed unimportant, would later be looked at by investigators looking for any clue to. What happened next? The northwest tree line marked a part of the forest about 200 yards from the cabin where the old hardwood trees gave way to younger trees. This area had been logged 20 years earlier and was now full of saplings and undergrowth. Deer did pass through that area often, especially at night when they thought they were less likely to be seen by people. But the phrase, "heard something moving," instead of "heard deer" or "saw deer," showed that there was at least some doubt about what Daines had found. D.N. should have written another entry on October 15th to record what he saw and get ready for the arrival of his relief guard the next morning. Company policy said that guards had to keep daily logs for fire safety and to have a record that could be looked at if there were questions about patrol coverage or strange events. However, the logbook for that date is empty. The page is still blank, and there are no new entries. Virgil Daines did something that happened between his note on October 14th and the morning of October 16th, when people first noticed he was missing. Fletcher Potats, a younger man who was the relief guard, got to the right checkpoint at 7 o'clock on the morning of October 16th. This checkpoint was a wide spot in the logging road where cars could turn around. It was the start of the last leg of the journey to Dan's station. Company policy said that outgoing guards had to meet their replacements at this checkpoint. This was to make sure that coverage continued and to allow for any sharing information about problems or situations in the areas they patrol. It took about 90 minutes to walk down from the station, just like it did to walk up. So guards would usually leave their posts around 5:30 in the morning to get to the checkpoint by 7. Potts thought that Daines had been delayed when they didn't show up by 7:30. This could have been because the trail was hard to navigate, a tree had fallen in the way, or he needed to finish something at the station before leaving. It wasn't unusual for guards to be late by a few minutes. Late. But by 8 o'clock, when there was still no sign of Daines and no sound of anyone coming through the forest, Potts started to worry. He walked up the trail for a little while, maybe a quarter mile, calling out every now and then. His voice echoed off the ridges. He didn't get an answer. All he could hear were the sounds of the forest, like birds and wind, and the sound of water rushing over rocks in the distance. Potats got back in his company truck, which had seen better days, and drove back to the main camp, where he arrived around 9 o'clock. He told the dispatcher, a woman named Lenora Haskell, who worked out of a small office next to the camp's administrative building and handled all communications for the guard network. Following the usual procedure, Haskell tried to call Danes right away. 3 long cranks on the hand generator stopped. 2 short turns. Dan's station got a call. The hand crank system made a hollow mechanical noise, but no one answered. The ringing went on for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and a whole minute. Then Haskell, I disconnected and tried again. The same thing happened, same result on the 3rd try. At 10 o'clock, Haskell told Luther Carrick, the senior supervisor in charge of all guard operations in the Northern District. Carrick listened to the report and asked Potats a few questions about whether he had seen any signs of Danes on the trail or any signs that they had recently passed through. Then he decided to put together a group to hike up to the station and look into it themselves. He gathered 4 men, including himself, Fletcher Potats, who was familiar with the most recent event, William Rosser, a senior guard who had worked in these mountains for years, and Hadley, one of the logging crew foremen, whose first name no one seemed to use or remember, were both very familiar with the trail systems and could move through rough country surprisingly quickly, even though they were in their 50s. They left the main camp a little before 11, each man carrying water and basic supplies in case the investigation went late into the night. The hike was hard and steep, even for men who are used to being in the mountains. The trail kept going up, following a road that tried to find the easiest way but still needed a lot of elevation gain. After about 30 minutes, they crossed the first ridge and went down into a hollow where a small stream flowed over a bed of smooth stones that had been worn down by water over the years. The climb to the second ridge then began. The air was cool, probably in the mid-50s, which made it comfortable for hiking. It was also cold enough that they could see their breath when they were going up the steepest parts when they were working hard and breathing hard. They didn't talk much while they climbed to save energy, and each man was lost in his own thoughts about what they might find. Fletcher Potts, the youngest and most worried, sometimes asked if they thought Danes might be hurt, might have fallen and hurt himself, or might need help right away. Carrick would say something short like, "They'll find out soon enough." There was no point in guessing until they had real information to work with. This was good advice. It was calm, practical, and made sense. As they climbed higher into the forest, the tension between the 4 men didn't go away. They got to Dnee's station around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, even though the ground was rough. The clearing where the cabin was quiet. There was no smoke coming from the stovepipe, so there was no sign of life. The building was exactly where it should have been. No visible damage, and no signs of disturbance other than what you would expect from the weather and time. But all 4 men thought something was off about the scene, even though if they had been asked to say what was bothering them, they would have had a hard time doing so. Carrick was the first to go to the door. The other 3 men stayed back a little and watched. He knocked 3 times with his knuckles and yelled Dine's name. No answer. He tried the door and found that it wouldn't move. There were no locks on these cabins, so they weren't locked with a key. Instead, they were locked from the inside with a wooden crossbar that dropped into heavy iron brackets on either side of the doorframe. The crossbar, which was a length of squared timber about 4 inches thick and 5 feet long, could only be lifted into place by someone inside the cabin. There was no way to lock it from the outside. There is no way to make an interior lock look like it is not real. Carrick stepped back and looked at the others. He could see that they were just as confused as he was. He walked around the cabin, looking at each wall and window. There were 3 windows in the building, each about 18 inches square and covered with burlap sacking that had been treated with linseed oil so that it could let in light while also being somewhat water-resistant. The sack was still hanging where it always does, held up by small nails. There were no tears, no signs of anyone forcing their way through these openings, and no signs of anyone being pushed. It would have been hard for a normal-sized man to get through the windows, but not impossible, especially if he was determined or desperate. But if Danes had gone out through a window, he would have had to push the burlap covering outward, which is likely what he did. Taking it off its tacks in the process and then somehow carefully putting it back on from the outside, which would be hard and probably leave signs of disturbance. There was no sign of this in any of the windows. They looked exactly how they should have. Normal and undisturbed. Carrick went back to where the other men were waiting after he had finished his circuit of the building. He stood there for a moment thinking, and then said they needed to break in. He told Hadley to go back down the trail and get an axe from a tool cache that was halfway between the station and the checkpoint, which was where they kept emergency supplies for times like this. Hadley came back in 40 minutes, breathing hard from the quick descent and climb. He had a double-bit axe with a handle that had been worn smooth from years of use. Carrick chose the north window as the entry point because it was the farthest away from the door that would swing open. He thought that if they were going to damage the building, they might as well keep things running as smoothly as possible. He used the axe to break through the burlap and the wooden frame, making the hole big enough for a man to get through. Fletcher Potts was the smallest of the group, so he went in first. He carefully made his way through the broken window, avoiding the sharp edges of the wood, and then found his footing on the floor inside. The inside was dark compared to the bright outside, so Potts stopped for a moment to let his eyes get used to it. He could see the inside of the cabin as his vision got better. Everything looked neat, almost too neat. He went to the door, took the heavy wooden crossbar off its brackets, put it aside, and opened the door from the inside so that the others could come in normally. The 4 men walked into the cabin and stood just inside the door, looking around and trying to figure out what they were seeing. The cot was neatly made, with the blankets tucked in with military precision and the corners squared in a way that suggested training or a long-standing habit. The pillow was smooth and undisturbed at the head. The only thing in the wood stove was cold ash, the kind of ash that comes from a fire that burned itself out completely and has been cold for a long time, maybe a full day or more. There was a tin plate on the table with what looked like beans and cornbread on it. The food was now dry and stale, but there were no signs that animals had disturbed it, like tracks where mice or rats had eaten it. Someone had put a fork next to the plate, parallel to its edge, with the kind of care that showed they knew how to behave at the table. There was a tin cup with cold coffee in it nearby. There was a film of dust or condensation on the surface of the dark liquid. The logbook was open on the table, and the entry for October 14th was written in Danes's usual blocky style. His pencil, which had been used for months and was now a stub, marked his place as if he had left it there to finish another entry. The Winchester lever-action model 1894 rifle, which was chambered in .30-30 caliber, hung on wooden pegs above the doorframe, where it would be easy to reach. Easy to get to in case of an emergency. William Rosser, who sometimes had to make sure that guards were keeping their weapons in good shape, took down the rifle and looked at it. He said that the tube magazine should always have 7 rounds in it, which is how it should be kept. Ready, but safe. He tested the action, and it worked fine. No rust and no visible damage. Dan's boots were heavy leather work boots with rawhide laces. The soles were worn thin from thousands of miles of walking on rocky mountain trails. They sat by the door, as if he had just stepped out of them. There was no mud or unusual wear on them, so they were dry clean. He had 2 pairs of work pants and shirts hanging from nails on the wall. How guards usually kept their few things in order in the small space. The guards kept his personal things on a shelf. A straight razor with a bone handle, a comb with a few broken teeth, a small mirror with silvering that had worn away around the edges, and the king. James' version, with a black leather cover that has cracked from age and use. Carrick stood in the middle of the cabin, slowly turning around and looking at everything, trying to find something that didn't belong or a clue to what had happened here. But everything pointed to a man who had left his dinner for a moment and then just disappeared. The only things missing were Danes himself and, most importantly, his jacket. It was a heavy canvas coat lined with wool that all guards wore. Usually hung on a peg near the door during the winter, that peg was free. But if Danes had planned to go outside for some reason, why didn't he put on his boots? Why would he go out into the cold mountains in October with just socks on? The strange thing bothered all four men. They talked about it for a short time and came up with some ideas. Maybe he had only gone outside for a short time. Maybe to check on a noise, maybe to go to the bathroom, planning to come back right away, and so not bothering. With shoes. But if that was what he wanted to do, why did he take the jacket? And why, most importantly, had he locked the door from the inside before he left? You had to be inside the cabin to move the crossbar. From the outside, it was impossible to lift it into place. But the cabin was locked, and Denise was gone. They searched the small room carefully, looking under the cot in the corners and checking the walls for any hidden openings or passages. They didn't find anything strange. The floor was. There were solid, rough planks nailed to joists that rested on stone piers. There was no crawl space or hidden compartment. The walls were made of solid logs that had been chinked and weathered, but they were still standing. The ceiling was made of rough boards, with joists showing through. It was all normal and not very interesting. There was no way for a person to hide in this space, and there was no way for Danes to still be there without being seen right away. William Rosser saw something that the others had missed. On the little shelf close to, there was a small notebook with a cardboard cover and about 50 pages of lined paper on the cot, which was partly hidden by the shaving items. Rossier carefully opened it and saw that it was full of writing that he knew was Dan's. He flipped through the pages and saw that it looked like a personal journal, separate from the official logbook. It had notes and thoughts that Danes had apparently not thought were appropriate for the formal company record. Carrick took the notebook and started to read the entries. Most were. There were boring notes about animals and the weather, and sometimes thoughts about how lonely the work was, but some entries stood out. One from September talked about strange marks on trees near the northwest ridge. Danes said that the symbols carved into the bark were too deliberate to be natural damage. He told Carrick about these, but Carrick seems to have dismissed them as old surveyor marks left over from timber cruising operations years before. Another entry from early October said that the sounds at night seemed different from the normal sounds of the forest. D&E had a hard time putting his thoughts into words, but it seemed to bother him enough to write about it. The last entry in this personal notebook was made on October 13th, the day before he wrote in his last official logbook. It said, "The woods feel different lately. I can't explain it better than that. Something about the silence after dark. Usually you hear owls, hear small animals moving in the leaves, and hear the wind in the branches. But the last few nights there have been times when everything stops. There is complete silence for about 10 or 15 minutes. Then the normal sounds start to come back. I told Drum about it when I saw him this afternoon. He said he had noticed something similar around his station. It was probably nothing, but it stays with you. That kind of silence makes you realize how alone you really are up here." Carrick closed the notebook and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at the other three men and saw his own unease reflected in their faces. They came expecting to find Deanie's hurt or sick and a situation they could fix with practical action. Instead, they found a puzzle that didn't make sense right away and a scene that suggested something beyond their experience or understanding. The search that followed lasted 9 days and involved more than 30 people at its peak. The initial group of 4 was quickly joined by every available guard from other stations, 17 men in total, plus logging crew members who knew the area, perhaps another dozen, and volunteers from the nearby towns of Marlington and Hillsborough came over the next few days after hearing about the missing guard. By the 3rd day, state police had arrived with 3 tracking dogs and more organized search procedures based on previous missing person cases in the area. The dogs, who had successfully tracked fugitives and lost people before, acted strangely from the start. When they were brought to the cabin, they made it clear that they were not happy about it. The dogs were hesitant to go in, pulling back against their leads and whining in a way that their handlers found strange. The dogs had been trained to be confident and focused, not easily distracted or scared. But at Daines's station, all 3 showed the same reluctance, which their handlers couldn't explain with any obvious environmental factor. Once inside the cabin, the dogs seemed unable to pick up a clear scent trail. They would sniff around the inside. The dogs would circle the cot and table, then go to the door and start in different directions, only to stop after a few yards and mill around as if they were confused or couldn't focus on any one scent. One dog, a bloodhound named Rufus, who had a particularly impressive record, sat down outside the cabin after several attempts to track and refused to work at all, despite his handler's efforts to motivate him with commands and encouragement. The handler, a state police corporal named Davies, who'd worked with Rufus. For 4 years, the investigators said they had never seen the dog act this way. They had never seen Rufus give up on a track without at least trying to follow a trail. The searchers were divided into teams, each given a sector to search that radiated outward from the station. They worked methodically, moving in a line through the forest while keeping an eye on the person to their left and right and calling out when they found anything that might be important. The terrain made this hard. The slopes of the mountains were steep and covered in thick vegetation that made it hard to see. In some places, thickets of laurel made it almost impossible to get through, forcing the search lines to break formation and find their way around these obstacles. Rocky outcrops and fallen trees made things even harder, hiding bodies from casual view and needing closer inspection. They searched all day on October 16th, returning to the main camp after dark, tired and empty-handed. They started again at first light on the 17th. They expanded the search area, covering more ground, and did it again on the 18th and 19th every day, going further from the station, following every game trail, checking every ravine and hollow, and looking at the banks of streams for any sign that someone had recently passed through. The weather was mostly clear and cool, which was good for working outside. But because it hadn't rained, the ground was hard, making it hard to find tracks except in the few muddy spots along streams or around springs. And even in those places, the searchers didn't find anything conclusive, like boot prints or signs of someone walking, running, or crawling through the forest. On the 3rd day of the search, October 19th, one of the volunteers found something that seemed important. Gideon Mercer, a farmer from just outside Hillsborough who joined the effort out of a sense of duty to his community, was following a deer trail about half a mile northwest of the station when he saw something that seemed strange to him. 7 stones arranged in a careful pile. The stones were stacked in a way that made them look like they were meant to be there, with each one being a little bigger than the last. Mercer called over the nearest searcher and pointed out the stone pile. They looked at it together, trying to figure out if it might be some kind of marker left by Daines, if he had been trying to find his way through the forest in the dark, or when he was confused. Within an hour, as word spread and more searchers gathered in that area, they found 6 more piles like this spaced out at random intervals along a path that generally went down a slope toward a steep ravine. Each pile had exactly 7 stones stacked in the same graduated pattern. The largest stones at the base of each pile were about the size of a man's fist, while the topmost stones were no bigger than large marbles. When Sergeant Howell Merritt, the state police investigator in charge of the search, heard about this discovery, he looked at the... Merritt personally examined the stone piles, taking pictures of each one and measuring the distances between them in an effort to figure out what they might mean. In his report, filed on October 21st, he said he thought they could be important, possibly trail markers left by Danes if he had been trying to find his way through unfamiliar territory, or if he had been in a different mental state that made him do the same thing over and over. However, Merritt also acknowledged that there were still a lot of questions about the piles. They looked new, with no lichen growth. There was no disturbance from the weather or animals, which suggests that the stones were placed there recently. Fresh could mean days or weeks, and even if they were connected to Dan's disappearance, what did they mean? Were they a deliberate attempt to mark a path, a message, or just the actions of a stressed mind doing something pointless? Casper Drum, when shown the stone piles, made an observation that others had been hesitant to make. The piles led toward the ravine, which was a place that no experienced woodsman would choose to go, especially after dark or in any condition where judgment might be impaired. The ravine was steep, its slopes covered with loose rock and deadfall, descending sharply to a creek bed lined with boulders and fallen trees. To follow that route deliberately would be dangerous. To do so at night would be suicidal for anyone familiar with the terrain. And Danes, whatever his limitations, knew these woods thoroughly after 3 years of patrolling them. He would have understood would have stayed away from that area under normal circumstances.